And I'm flying solo today, and going to go over several of the interesting articles and YouTube videos and other stuff that I found for this week's Arete. Arete is a weekly list of curated links to articles and other pieces of information, YouTube videos, and podcasts that I find every week that are in the lanes that we work with here at MTI. So military, national security, homeland security, law enforcement, wildland fire. We have a section for mountain sports and outside sports, a section for health and fitness and nutrition, a section on gear, if I find anything that's interesting on gear, and then also just a section on just interesting articles that I come across that maybe don't fall into one of the other categories. So what I'm trying to do with Arete, and it's kind of a pet project of mine, and I enjoy doing it. It just helps me keep abreast of some of the major issues that are working and affecting the athletes that we work with here at Mountain Tactical Institute. So mountain tactical athletes, obviously. And also, I just find it really interesting and enjoyable for me to do personally. I understand the articles that and the links that make Arete are ones that I find either important and or interesting. And so I'm not trying to give a breakdown of everything that happened previously in the week in these areas, but just the ones that stand out to me. And they can stand out to me for different reasons. Sometimes it's the source. Sometimes it's a contrarian view. And sometimes it's just the uniqueness of the article or the podcast or video. Anyway, I kind of want to start this week with one of the links we have in this week's Arete, and it's from the All In podcast, which is a podcast I listen to weekly. It's been going on since COVID, and the hosts are kind of tech entrepreneurs. And when I first started listening to it, they primarily just spoke about technology and business trends and investments in technology companies, which I always find kind of interesting. And they've since moved on to broaden it out to politics and other issues. But recently they have a podcast up where they interview two professors concerning national security and the U.S. posture towards national security. And I'd never heard of either of these individuals, and I thought their thoughts were really intriguing. The first professor is a gentleman named Dr. Jeffrey Mersheimer, and he's a political scientist from the University of Chicago. And the second professor is Dr. Jeffrey Sachs. He's an economist from Columbia University. And what would really intrigue me about this discussion was how these two gentlemen really had a lot of respect for each other, but really had different opinions and ideas of what the U.S. posture should be towards China. And that's kind of what I'm going to discuss here a little bit. I understand I'm hardly an expert on these two individuals, but just gathering what I could from the podcast. Dr. Mersheimer, he's the political scientist. He believes in the what he calls the offensive realism theory of national security and foreign relations. And under this theory, power is everything. He describes it, the foreign policy of the world in the different countries that they interact with each other is anarchist. In other words, there's no overseeing power that directs everything. And so it's within each individual country's interest to be as powerful as possible to protect their interests and protect themselves. And one of the things he talked about when it comes to U.S. is he describes that the U.S. has been a ruthless national power, just a ruthlessly powerful over the years. And specifically, U.S. is regional hegemony. Hegemony. Sorry if I messed that up, but essentially the U.S. Has a sphere of influence, and it's the Western Hemisphere, and we kind of rule over the Western Hemisphere. And Dr. Mersheimer argues that because we really don't have any nearby threats, it allows us to roam around the world and poke our noses in the business of other countries in far-flung parts of the world that aren't in the Western Hemisphere. And now, according to Dr. Sachs, his opinion is a little bit different. Unlike Dr. Mersheimer, he doesn't believe that national security is a zero-sum game, and he's an economist, of course, and he believes that there's no reason that all countries can't win, and it doesn't necessarily mean that one has to outpower the other. When it comes down to China, this is where the two diverge a little bit, or significantly. Dr. Mersheimer again argues that because the U.S. Has control over our region, the Western Hemisphere, it allows us to, stick our nose in other parts of the world. And he said one of the problems with China is that if we allow China to become in control regionally of Asia, they'll start sticking their noses in other parts of the world, and thus we'll have these two significant powers, and conflict will be inevitable. And so Dr. Mersheimer argues that we should continue to contain China and keep it from becoming its own regional hegemony in Asia. But Dr. Sachs disagrees. He says that because of the ocean and the distance between us and China, between the Western Hemisphere and Asia, that as long as we keep our distance and we don't stick our noses too close to China, and China doesn't do the same to us here in the Western Hemisphere, there's no reason that we need to have an inevitable conflict. And it's just as you listen to this podcast, it's just really interesting to hear these two gentlemen talk about it. The podcast is pretty long. It's about an hour long, and there's a link to it in Arete. And if you want to fast forward, I think it's a minute 21:45, so 21 minutes, 45 seconds is when they discuss the China discussion, if you're interested. And I encourage you to listen to it. One of the interesting things about this is it kind of circles back to an article that we had a contributing writer write for me a few months ago about a base in Peru that China is building. It's a deep water port in Peru, and it has primarily commercial applications, but because it's a deep water port, it could also have military applications. It could also be a military base for China. And the task I gave my contributing writer, who's an author named Matt Lensing, and he's a infantry officer in the Army actually, was to question or ask the question and try to answer whether or not China's base in Peru violated the Monroe Doctrine. And if you can't remember back to your middle school days, the Monroe Doctrine was put in place by President Monroe, and it was this informal doctrine to the rest of the world that said, U.S. has control of the Western Hemisphere, stay out. No colonization, no bases, and we've pretty much protected the Monroe Doctrine all those years. And maybe the one time it really came to head was the Cuban Missile Crisis in the early 60s. So that's an example of us protecting and enforcing the Monroe Doctrine. Anyway, that article is on a website, what Matt came up with in his analysis, and it's pretty fascinating. It's a really short article. You just go to the website and search for the Monroe Doctrine. You'll find the article, and you can read it about this base and his analysis of whether or not it may violate the Monroe Doctrine. Interestingly, in this discussion between Mersheimer and Sachs, there was no mention of this base in Peru. Sachs specifically mentioned, as long as China doesn't try to build a base in Mexico, we shouldn't have a problem with it. But again, Peru is in the Western Hemisphere. Anyway, overall, it's just a really fascinating high level look at national security, two different philosophies of national security, and an application of those two different philosophies to China. And how it'll affect our athletes, of course, is as the U.S. seems to pivot its national security interests to Asia and to the Pacific because of China. It's affecting the athletes we work with as they start to move in that direction in terms of training and deployments and everything else. Again, that's just the All In podcast, and there's a link in Arete. The next story that I really found interesting was a story, and it was on military.com, and it's a story about the Army testing robot dogs They're armed with artificial intelligence-enabled rifles in the Middle East. And according to the story, these dogs, they look like just a robot dog, and they got pretty much an M4 mounted on top. And they're equipped with a AI system to shoot down drones. And they're supposedly much more accurate and faster than soldiers can be in terms of shooting down drones. But what made me think about this, obviously, was looking at this picture on the website and looking at this article. It looks like this could be deployed in any kind of land battle infantry type situation. And I know that Charlie and I spoke a while ago about the changing nature of warfare, perhaps with what we're learning in Ukraine, and how in the future Charlie had predicted that it'll be robots versus robots. And sure enough, in this story, the author mentions that in May, the Chinese army debuted its own robot dog armed with a rifle during a training exercise in Cambodia. And it had the armed robot dog engaged in breaching operations alongside infantry soldiers. So its robot or drone dog with a rifle was, right along infantry soldiers, which, of course, is where perhaps this is moving. And all this kind of reminds me of there was a case a few years ago. I can't remember when, but there was an active shooter in Dallas who killed several police officers in Dallas. And he ended up holding himself up in some type of commercial building. And he was eventually killed, not by a sniper or by law enforcement officer with a rifle, but rather the Dallas Police Department sent in some type of mobile drone, which was equipped with an explosive device. And if I understand correctly, remember, they actually blew up the wall next to where this shooter was sitting or housed and killed him that way. And there was quite a bit of controversy about that use of the robot, to take this active shooter out in this instance. And I just thought about that as I read this, and I certainly sense, and it's pretty obvious that robots remotely operated, perhaps with lethal weapons, are becoming more and more important part of not only the U.S. military operations but also law enforcement. And I also am a little bit surprised that I haven't seen the same in the fire rescue. For firemen, how come are we, for example, not using or sending firemen into old apartment buildings or warehouses, or just houses to put out abandoned, warehouses to put out fires. Every week there seems to be another fireman injured or killed trying to suppress a fire in an abandoned building. And I'm just wondering if there aren't, and there must be, robot applications for that type of work too, where we can, send in the robot, and instead of carrying the robot dog, instead of carrying a rifle, it's carrying a hose, and it works to put out the fire. Anyway, I'm sure that's coming someday, but I just found this really interesting. And again, that story article was in the military.com. Kind of pivoting to first responders and fire rescue specifically, there's a story in the Fire Law blog, which is one of the websites I kind of look at for fire rescue type articles, about a United Kingdom or a British firefighter who was sentenced to prison for taking photos of an accident victim. And I thought this was really interesting. He was sentenced to 20 months in jail, and apparently he took photos of a two-car car crash, and one man was killed in the car crash, and this firefighter took pictures of his body and posted it to WhatsApp. And this is found out, and he was fired and charged criminally with misconduct in public office, and now he's going to prison for it. I just thought that was interesting. I haven't heard of anything like that in the United States, or seen a story to that effect with something graphic like this. A few years ago, actually in Jackson, Wyoming, there was an avalanche that hit one of the lodges that was a mid-mountain lodge. And of course, this was a big story locally. It was a big snow year, and one of the SAR responders, one of the search and rescue team responders who responded to that avalanche, actually took a picture of the snow had where it had breached and come into the lodge. I mean, nobody was killed in the incident or anything, but I do remember that that individual, he had a kind of a newsy backcountry skiing website on his own, and he posted it there, and he was promptly fired by the local search and rescue team. So again, that's the only case of this I've kind of seen or heard about. I'm sure there are others, but for some reason, if there are, they just haven't come to my attention here in the U.S., and that's why this story there in the Britain did kind of come to my attention. I thought it was just interesting. Along with law enforcement, Charlie on my staff just did a research roundup, and he found a study that was recently completed that took a look at law enforcement academy fitness levels and injury rate correlation. And in the study's titled "The Influence of Physical Fitness on Reasons for Academy Separation in Law Enforcement Recruits." Took a look at 401 recruits who went through five law enforcement academy classes in Southern California. And their gait PFT test when these recruits came in was 1 minute push-ups, 1 minute sit-ups, vertical jump, a medicine ball throw, 70-yard kind of a pursuit sprint, or 75-yard. It's kind of like a change of direction, 75-yard sprint designed to mimic chasing a suspect. And then the final event in the test was a beep test, or it's called a multi-stage fitness test. Have you ever done one of those before? You set up two cones 20 meters apart, and there's a recording, and it beeps, and you got to run to the other cone before it beeps again. And as the test ensues, the beeps get closer and closer together, and you're scored on how far along in the time you get. Anyway, this study found that push-up strength and medicine ball throw and sit-ups and sit-up performance on the fitness test were not correlated to recruits who successfully graduated from the academy. What was correlated was performance on the 75-yard pursuit shuttle and performance on the beep test. And the implication was that the aerobic fitness and running fitness had a better determination of academy success than the push-ups and the sit-ups and the other more strength, power-related fitness events. What was interesting also was that the study found that not only did the candidates who did better on the 75-yard shuttle and the beep test have fewer injuries and not get separated from the academy for injuries, but also fewer of them voluntarily left the academy or quit on their own. And it just reminded me that it's probably pretty difficult to prepare, especially if they nail going in. It's more difficult to prepare. When I say difficult, I mean it just takes more work and it's harder, perhaps, to prepare for the beep test than it is for a push-up test. And it shows some motivation on the athletes who did well on the beep test, that they came in perhaps prepared more ahead of time and therefore were more motivated when they got there, and that transferred them not quitting. Anyway, it's just kind of an interesting study in law enforcement. Finally, in their first responder world, there's a story in Vox, which is a website that I look for articles. It has a lot of interesting articles on it. And the question asked, how common are back-to-back hurricanes? Climatologist answers. Of course, Milton just hit Florida. I think, it left that state or is moving through that state yesterday or maybe today, and it's probably still remnants of it. And we just had Helene, maybe 2 weeks ago, and it just seemed odd that we'd have these two major hurricanes back to back. And then back in August, there's another hurricane, Debbie, that came through. So, three significant hurricanes hit the Gulf Coast or Florida here between August 5th and October 7th, so a couple months. And this seems, at least to me, it seemed uncommon but in fact, I guess it's not very uncommon. According to this climatologist who works for the state of Florida, he was interviewed for this article, and she says, yeah, it's not uncommon. And most recently, in 2020, there were 30 named storms, including 7 hurricanes that year, 3 of which hit the United States in September and October. What is a little bit different about this year, according to this climatologist, was that how fast the storms intensify once they develop. And the climatologist attributed this to unseasonably warm waters in the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean Sea, and the Atlantic Ocean basin. Warmer water, much warmer water than normal is what she said. In addition, it's just been hotter. The temperature's been warmer. And so what I understand from this article and the comments of this climatologist is that there aren't necessarily more hurricanes now, but they seem to intensify faster than they did before. In other words, they're not necessarily getting more intense than they used to get, but they do get more intense faster. And she attributed it to the warm water and warm temperatures. Excuse me. Anyway, I just thought that was really interesting. Kind of moving on to some mountain stuff. I hadn't seen this story in any of the mountain type publications that I look at weekly. Outside Magazine, Climbing Magazine, Gripped Magazine, many others. But there's a story actually in Pravda, which is kind of the Russian government news source, that 5 Russian climbers were killed in just this week trying to climb the 7th highest mountain in the world in Nepal. It's called Mount Dhaulagiri. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I apologize for slaughtering that. But apparently these climbers, there were 6 total in the group. One of the climbers didn't like the weather, didn't like the conditions, and didn't want to make the final summit push. They're at the high camp, and it's not clear, but I just gathered from the article that they were making their summit push, the 5 others, and something happened to them, and all 5 perished. Which, if it had been on Everest or something else, would be major news. And I'm just surprised this hasn't been picked up by Outside or anybody else. I'm not too sure why Pravda would lie about this. So it seems like a fairly, it could be, a true story. Anyway, I think what is significant, of course, is, we lost these 5 mountaineers. They got to be fairly high-level mountaineers. I think they were, self-supported climbing. They've been there a month. They don't think they were being guided. So to do a peak like that, you kind of got to know your way around the mountains ahead of time. And they're self-supported, and still, 5 or 6 of them perished. Just an interesting story. Again, I think the source is significant, especially because this hasn't been picked up by any other mountain type publication or website. And I'm not too sure they've seen it, or perhaps they don't trust the source, but I'm not too sure why Pravda would report about this. It's not like it puts Russia in a good light here. I do feel sorry for these climbers. Another story in our mountain section of Arete this week. It's not a story, it's a YouTube video actually that I came across, and it's called The Opener. And The Opener is just a profile of a group of guys in upstate New York and the opening week of duck season, which is always the first week in October. I'm not a duck hunter. I've never really done much duck hunting at all, and when I have done it, I've failed miserably. But this is just a delightful short video on YouTube. It's about 10 minutes long, and I'd encourage anybody who hunts or doesn't hunt to watch it. A lot of the hunting videos you see on YouTube feature self-promoting hunters who, it seems like most of the video is more about the killing and the big trophy than it is about what I feel is most important about the hunt, which is the experience and the camaraderie and being out there with friends. And the opener of this video really gets at that well. It's really a delightful video. You can see these guys, the tradition that their families have built on going out and duck hunting the first week in October. They go to some marsh. They're wet the whole time. It's fairly miserable weather. Rains all the time. They really don't shoot many ducks, and if they really don't care if they shoot many ducks. One of the characters is just a funny guy, and I want to say he's a clown, but anyway, it's really a delightful movie, and whether you're a hunter or not, I think it gets at the joy that a lot of us have for the outdoors, and it really, I think, points to some of the greatest aspects of hunting, which aren't necessarily the killing, but really being out there, being in the elements. Hunting is just an excuse to be out there, enjoying that, and enjoying the camaraderie that can come with that. A lot of the hunting I've done recently is, solo backcountry bow hunting, and I tell you, I'd much rather be out there with somebody. So that's still fun, but especially after watching this YouTube short episode. Again, it's just delightful is the only way I can describe it. I encourage anybody listening to this to watch it. It's called The Opener. There's a link to it in Arete. You could probably just go to YouTube and search The Opener. And if you see something about duck hunting in upstate New York, that's the one. Next is we're kind of pivoting to fitness, and there's an author who writes often for Outside Magazine named Alex Hutchinson, and I don't know if I've spoken to him, but I've definitely emailed back and forth with him before, and I really respect the work he does. But he has a story, and it's titled "The Problem with Tracking Sleep Data." The latest wearables have gotten much more accurate at logging our Z's. Too bad researchers haven't figured out how to use the data. And there were just some stats in here. He does mention that how the wearables that we use, Apple Watch, Whoop, other type of wearables, are really doing a pretty good job of tracking sleep data. He says there studies have found they're 86 to 89% accurate of determining when we're sleeping or not, and 50 to 60% accurate on identifying what sleep stage we're in. So light sleep or deep REM sleep, they're about 50% accurate for that. But in terms of overall sleeping, they're about 86% accurate. And, experts anticipate that this accuracy will get better and better. The question is what you do with this data. And, does it mean if you got a poor night's sleep that you shouldn't work out that hard that day or whatever? I do know that I haven't done it in a while, but for a year I wore a Garmin watch around, and I would take a look at my sleep score every morning, and my son does the same, and other friends of his do also, and they come in and compare their sleep score in the mornings. But what does that mean? And how should you use that data? And that's where the quandary is. He says that for now, the best approach is to establish a baseline and then look for changes. So if you usually get 15 to 20% of deep sleep at night, and that changes to 10 or 15%, you might want to try to figure out why. Perhaps you're stressed out or on your phone right before you go to sleep, whatever. However, he points out there's a risk to being too obsessive about your sleep score. I guess there's been a study that said anxiety related to sleep can both be a symptom and a cause of some sleep problems. There was an Oxford University study in 2018 involved giving subjects bogus feedback on whether or not they slept well or poorly. Those who were told that they'd slept poorly the night before, so it was just bogus, reported feeling scattered, fatigued, and cranky that day. So it says a little bit of data can be a dangerous thing, especially if its accuracy is questionable. So that's just interesting. It shows a psychological effect of perhaps seeing that you had a shitty sleep score that night before and making you cranky. Doesn't necessarily mean you need to be cranky. Anyway, interesting story, article in Outside Magazine or Outside Online. And then finally, I want to finish with an interview that I did with Snowbrains, which is a website that kind of covers skiing and free skiing. And one of the questions they asked, of course, they reached out to me because they're doing a story, and just about every one of these websites this time of year kind of does a story on ski fitness, and they had some questions about ski fitness. But one of the questions they had was, why don't you just ski to get more fit? And this question has come up a lot over the years, over the 20 years I've worked with mountain athletes. It's generally much more fun if you're a mountain athlete to go out and ski than to come into my facility or to have come into my facility or do one of our preseason ski dryland programs, which are very intense and pretty damn hard actually. And my answer is that in general, it's much more efficient to train fitness in the gym than it is on the mountain. And let me just explain that. Let's say that on the mountain, you want to train ski fitness early in the season. One way you could do that would be to go down the same slope, just a groom slope, and make as many turns as you can down the slope each run. The problem with that is that the slope conditions may change. For example, let's say you do it one day and it's nice and groomed. The next day it's icy. And so the number of turns you can make when it's icy are going to be significantly less than you can when it's a nice groomed soft snow that you're skiing on. Also, the slope that you're skiing on, the incline of it will change over the run of the slope. So it might start super steep and then taper out as it gets down to the bottom near the lift. Anyway, it's just difficult to be consistent and measure apples to apples as you build your fitness if you're doing it on the mountain. And this is across all the different areas of mountain sports that I've worked with. Kayaking, backcountry, alpine skiing, climbing, alpine climbing, rock climbing, etc. We just couldn't control for consistency in the training apparatus, and that meant it was difficult to progress, to design training sessions and programs, and then progress that training over the course of several weeks, because you couldn't depend on the consistency. Secondly, I would add that not only is it difficult and inefficient to train fitness on the mountain, it's also difficult and inefficient to train technique in the gym. For example, there are some coaches who will prescribe Bosu ball stands to train balance during the preseason before skiing. And I've always thought that the transfer of being able to stand on a Bosu ball to the balance needed, skiing down a slope or skiing moguls or skiing powder, I think the transfer is small, if any. And I think it's just much better to actually train that technique when you're on the mountain, actually skiing. So the point here is that it's better to train fitness in the gym and technique on the mountain or when you're skiing. So how does this relate to preseason skiing or preseason fitness for skiing? Well, what happens for most athletes, especially those serious about skiing or competing athletes, free skiers, competing free skiers, alpine racers, etc., is that for most of us, or for most people, when they get to the opening day of the new ski season, which in Wyoming is right around Thanksgiving weekend, most people haven't skied for, since April, or maybe early June if they were doing some backcountry stuff in the spring. So several months of not skiing. And what that means is that regardless of their fitness going in, what that means is that their skills, their skiing technique skills are going to be rusty. They just haven't skied much. By going into the early season not ski specific fit, what that means is those first few weeks of the early season, the ability of the athlete to kick the rust out of their skiing technique and actually start improving technique will be limited by their fitness. So, for example, the first week they get back to slopes, they're able to ski hard for half a day, and then they got to quit. Or they'll have to ski hard one day and take the next day off. And all that time off is time that they're not working on technique. And at the highest levels, it's skiing technique that separates skiers. What being sport-specifically fit does for skiers going into the season is it means they don't necessarily need to limit their technique training by fitness. In other words, athletes who've done our programming get to the slopes and they are able to ski hard the whole day, day after day, because they arrive at the slopes fit, and therefore they're able to kick out the rust and actually start working on their technique earlier than athletes who didn't arrive on the slopes fit. And individually, this means that if you're serious about your skiing, that you're able to improve faster. If you're a competing athlete, especially a competing free skier or a sponsored athlete competing for sponsorships, or an athlete competing for sponsorships or whatever, technique separates often those who get the sponsorships and win the races from those who don't. And it means that if you arrive unfit, that your competitors are going to be able to work on their technique faster, and it'll just set you back. So again, the idea, what Sport Pacific does for mountain sports, it allows you to get to the season, get to the mountain, Sport Pacifically fit, so you can start working on technique as soon as you get there. And this matters a lot if you're interested in improving your skiing, in this case, or if you're a competitor. It gives you an edge up on the people you're competing against. Anyway, that's it for this week's podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, just leave them below, or you can email me directly, rob@mtntactical.com, rob@mtntactical.com. Okay, until next week.